Most people who are familiar with The Masque remember it as a 90s wacky comedy starring Jim Carrey. Well, since I'm talking about that franchise on this channel, you have probably surmised that it was a comic book adaptation. While that is true, The Masque has a surprisingly long history starting in the 80s and continuing to this day, with the most recent offering coming as recently as 2020. So, let's see what the hullabaloo, do people still use that word, is all about. This is the first iteration of the character, or let's be blunt, a prototype of what the character would become. The Masque's concept came from Mike Richardson, the founder of Dark Horse Comics and the publisher where all future Masque comics would come from. Richardson would hand off the art and writing duties of his new creation to Mark Badger. Initially, The Masque was published in Dark Horse Presents starting from issue 10. As an anthology series that served as a launchpad for well-regarded titles like Concrete, The Masque was given the best possible opportunity to shine. However, it did not last long and was soon removed from the list of anthology stories in Dark Horse Presents. Apparently, this was because Mark Badger was being too political, which is hilarious considering what we have coming up later. But personally, the issue for me was that the title was a bit incomprehensible. The story starts in medias res, never a good sign for a completely new concept, and the art makes it quite difficult to tell what's happening at any given moment, or who it's happening to. In issue 12, for instance, there's an introduction page that seems like it's there to help, only to take the piss out of the readers for wanting a coherent structure. Frankly, I'm not sure if Mark Badger was just having the time of his life doing this, or was just seeing what he could get away with. But either way, Richardson would rip the concept away from him and hand it off to other creators for a second pass at it. Richardson would send his original sketch of the concept to artist Chris Warner, who gave the character his current look. As for the story, then upcoming talents, writer John Arcudi and artist Doug Mahnke, were given the task of putting the character in one. The newly re-Christianed The Masque start a seemingly quiet, put-down-upon man named Stanley Ipkiss, who we see buying an antique mask for his girlfriend Kathy Matthews. However, we soon see that Stanley is filled with thoughts of revenge upon those he felt has wronged him. And the mask he bought for Kathy gives him the perfect means to act out those revenge fantasies. Now, some of you may have heard that the comic The Masque was based on was more violent than the movie. And, well, you heard absolutely right. The comic has been described as a comedy horror story, and that's a pretty accurate description as we see Stanley inflicting his justice while wearing the titular mask. This leaves us with a fantastic take on He Who Fights Demons, as Stanley repeatedly states that he intends to become a superhero with the mask right after he has dealt with those he has perceived as having wronged him. We see him slip down the slope fairly quickly, starting off with people who we could technically root for to get their comeuppance, until he murders his former teacher and a bunch of cops who try to stop him. The story ends in a manner not too dissimilar to horror stories, with Stanley being killed by Kathy now wearing the mask, implying that she is about to go on a similar rampage. Yeah, Stanley Ipkiss, Jim Carrey's character from the movie, dies in the first Masque story, and he never returns to the land of the living. It's Kathy instead who goes on to have a more prominent role in the series as a recurring character. The story also introduces Lieutenant Mitch Kellaway, who is trying to stop the Big Head Killer's rampage, with Big Head being the name used to describe wearers of the mask moving forward. Kellaway's friend and fellow detective Lionel Ray also appears here as someone who tries to make sure that Kellaway keeps his head on his shoulders. Anyway, this story, first published as an anthology called Mayhem and later collected as The Masque Issue 0, serves as a prologue to the first Masque miniseries, which is where we get to see what Kathy ends up doing with the mask in her possession. So, the 1991 Masque series opens with Kathy walking into the police station and handing the mask to Lieutenant Kellaway and telling him not to wear it. Not only is this a bit unintentionally hilarious if you are reading this immediately after the previous issue, but it also marks a noted change in tone for the stories going forward. From here on, the Masque will continue to be a violent comic. The violence is more slapstick as opposed to being an outright bloodfest. While some people might say that it was a cop-out, I do feel that taking this direction was better for the longevity of the series. Granted, this is a comic that only seems to come out as an occasional mini-series, but what I mean by that is that uber violence has a chance to become very stale very quickly. Yes, Big Head is more like Woody Woodpecker from here on, but Mahnke's art gets brighter and we see quite a wide range of creative, let's call them takedowns, of the people Big Head fights with. Anyway, as for the plot, Kellaway ends up putting on the mask and becoming the new Big Head to take on all the gangs plaguing the city and giving him a hard time. Here's where we meet our final major recurring character, Walter, who is a big Hulk-like man who is the only one capable of taking Big Head's attacks and dishing out a fair bit of damage back to him, even though it doesn't stick. Walter starts out as muscle for the mob, but it becomes very clear that he only works for them because he wants to, and not the other way around. As for Kellaway, he stops being Big Head when the mask starts to influence him to kill Lionel, who was trying to stop him while he was rampaging. This leads to Kellaway burying the mask in his basement with cement so no one, not even him, can get to it again. Unfortunately, burying the mask only ends up biting Kellaway in the ass in the sequel, The Mask Returns, seemingly a reference to The Dark Knight Returns. When the mob sends assassins to off him in his own home, he tries to dig up the mask but is shot and left for dead. However, the assassins take the mask and put it on their driver Nunzio's face as a joke, leading to him becoming the next Big Head and taking over the mob. With Kellaway still recovering from being shot, Kathy ends up going undercover and getting the mask back from Nunzio, although she has to put it on herself again to fight Walter. This one ends with the mask and Walter getting shoved into the river by Kellaway, leading straight into The Mask Strikes Back, this time potentially a Star Wars reference. So in this 4-issue mini, we see what happens when an anarchist, a punk rocker, a stoner, and a nerd each get to wear the mask. This might be the most creative out of all the Mask stories so far, relying more on comedy than just violence. It also helps that the 4 stereotypes mentioned are also friends with each other and have a bit more depth than you would think. The comic ends hilariously too, with Kellaway convincing the guy to take off the mask in the last issue, and then Walter shows up. He tries to put on the mask and then fails because it's too small for his face. And then he leaves the series forever in disgust. That does not count, it's a spin-off. This was Arcudi and Mahnke's last main Masque story, though Mahnke does covers later on. And I can't find why they stopped working on this series regularly, but at least with Strikes Back, I can say that they went out on a high. Once Arcudi and Mahnke leave, the series becomes a bit of a mixed bag. The next two minis after this, The Hunt for Green October and Southern Discomfort, are basically the same story where the Masque acts as a MacGuffin for the protagonists of those stories to deal with the stuff that was troubling them. This essentially makes them like Stanley Ipkiss, except where he was deplorable, these people are sympathetic. And when they become Big Head, they are essentially forces for good. Kellaway becomes the only link to the overall plot as he goes to the places where a new Big Head pops up and tries to get them to take off the mask. There are a few chuckle-worthy bits, like Kellaway never actually meeting the Big Head in Southern Discomfort, but even the joke exists because Kellaway trying to convince a new Big Head to take off the mask was becoming a repetitive plot point. What does not help matters further is, thanks to the movie being released and the overall speculator bubble of the comics market, the Masque ended up being grossly overexposed during this period. He had multiple crossovers with other popular characters of the time like Grifter, Lobo, Martial Law, and the heroes of the Dark Horse Comics superhero imprint Comics Greatest World. Which I am only mentioning because before reading this, I did not know there was a superhero imprint of Dark Horse Comics. And it was quite a surreal experience reading a crossover with characters I did not know existed. So that's what it's like to be a new comic book reader. Thankfully, the Masque stopped showing up so frequently after 1997, and we get one last great story set in the main universe of the Masque. Bob Fingerman of Minimum Wage fame teams up with artist Sibin Slavkovic to give us Toys in the Attic. This is a much needed return to form for the Masque, with the violence level not as cartoony as before, but nowhere near as much as the original Mayhem stuff. Aldo Krasker works as a toy designer where he gets no respect, and to add salt to his mental wounds, he also gets mocking letters from his former classmates who are more successful than him. Unfortunately for those classmates, they start dropping dead one by one, as Aldo suddenly starts developing amazing ideas for a new toy line. Now there's a bit of a twist here which I'm not going to spoil, but this might be the best the Masque has been since Strikes Back. Enough time has passed for the violence to feel fresh again. And Kellaway actually does something a bit more significant in this one. Now, I wish I could end here before talking about some of the characters, but I guess I should address the most recent Masque comic first. Don't bother picking this one up, as it is bad. For some reason, the art for this comic has a dour, painted look that just does not suit the Masque. Even after Mahnke left, other artists still maintained a similar look for this series while adding their own style, so that the setting had its own identity. This is just poorly made, with the characters almost unrecognizable. Although that isn't entirely due to the art. In this dour, miserable version of the Masque, it's the future! Kellaway is a retired cop living away from the city. Kathy is a bitter politician, and Lionel has offed himself after using the mask one time, while the titular mask is in the hands of a presidential candidate. I'm sure this is some sort of commentary on the state of politics in America. This comic came out in late 2019, but dear God, it's bad. Hey, if the original Mask got cancelled for being political, what's this thing's excuse? At least Mark Badger knew what he was talking about. Right. For further reference, I'm ignoring I Pledge Allegiance to the Mask because I get a feeling that if there's a next installment in this franchise, it'll probably do the same. Okay, one of the most noteworthy things about The Mask is because of the downplaying of the more gory aspects of the series after the Mayhem stuff, Stanley Ipkiss unintentionally ends up appearing even more weak-willed than intended, as later on we see kids being able to use the mask without becoming too violent, and yet this does not hamper their ability to use the mask's powers in any way. Speaking of the mask's powers, it's a great lead-in to talk about Kathy. She is shown to be an extremely logical and no-nonsense person, which ironically makes her one of the worst users of the mask. Since its powers run on cartoon logic, Kathy finds it harder to wrap her head around stuff like surviving a hole in your chest or summoning weapons to fight Walter. It's an interesting take on a character who is shown to be smart and ordered, which should ideally prepare for most of the things that life throws at her. Except a logical mind has a hard time accepting the chaos that comes with the mask. As for Kellaway, he is technically the protagonist if we consider that he appears in almost every major canon Mask story, but his role doesn't really change from Strikes Back onward, and despite the occasional funny gag, he can feel a bit repetitive. But what about the mask itself? Well, we see a flashback in a dream that Kathy has about its origins, but that's about it. The mask appears to be indestructible and also sentient to a point, always pushing its wearers to get more violent. Again, the fact that only Stanley willingly gave in to the mask's urges just reinforces how much of an asshole he was. I think it's fair to say that The Mask has had an interesting history, going from political satire to gory comedy to slapstick violence to straightforward justice for the little man type of stories to murder mystery and back to political satire, terrible though it may be. It fascinates me that a concept which basically boils down to a person possessed by a mysterious object has managed to provide such a wide range of stories. So, if you are interested in reading The Mask after watching this video, I heavily recommend getting The Mask Omnibus Volume 1. While there is some bonus material missing from this, it contains all of the main work on The Mask done by Arcudi Mahnke. If you want more, try getting Toys in the Attic separately, or you could get the second Omni, which has all of the other stories besides I Pledge Allegiance to the Mask, which is honestly a plus in my book.
Okay.